Okay, well, we're 1 minute late, which isn't too bad. It takes me a while to get started anyway, so if there are any latecomers, they won't miss much. Some of you will have seen that we've just had an Estimates Day debate on the Select Committee report on the science budget, the House Commons Select Committee report. And I did manage to catch the closing statement, so hopefully this talk is still up to date. I should say that we've also produced research briefings. There's one on a statistical one and also one on policy, which was updated on Monday. So some of the hard copies that you see might be slightly out of date, although still valid. Okay. Well, this first slide is really just to give an indication of where funding for science comes from. By the way, do interrupt with any questions, and there will be time at the end for questions as well. A large part of it comes from business, and this is showing the spending on UK research and development since 1985. So in real prices, 2013 prices. So business is a major source of funding for research and development, as is government. Overseas important, including the European Union, of course. And then we have private non-profit, which is charities, medical charities particularly, and a little bit from higher education. Now, I think that those higher education numbers right at the bottom there are rather misleading, because I'm guessing that comes primarily from things like trusts, maybe overseas student fees, that kind of thing, because a lot of the higher education funding is actually included, I think, in the government curve. And I'll drill down gradually and get closer to the different sources of funding. So this is just to give you an overall impression of the different sectors that are responsible for supporting science. Here is the sum total over the same period from 1985 to the present day as a percentage of GDP. So while the figures in the previous graph were sort of going up, as a percentage of GDP, spending on science in total in the UK has fallen. It's currently about 1.7% of GDP. And this is roughly how we compare with our competitors in the European Union. The black bar just above the middle of that chart is the UK, showing you the 1.7% gross expenditure on research and development, or GERD, as a percentage of GDP. And so we're some way behind in percentage GDP terms. We're behind Germany and France, for example, not to mention Slovenia and Estonia, countries not normally associated with being scientific competitors. Now, you might argue that's not particularly important, and we'll come to that discussion presently. So, just as a rehearsal here in words, the inputs, as far as UK science is concerned, in 2013, gross domestic expenditure on research and development, or GERD, was £28.9 billion, which is 1.67% of GDP. Between 1985 and 2013, GERD grew by 52% in real terms, but not as fast as the economy. So as a percentage of GDP over that period, GERD has fallen from just over 2% to just under 1.7%. What do we get for these inputs? Well, with 0.9% of the world's population spending 3.2% of the world's expenditure on research and development, we produce almost 16% of the most important research output in terms of citations. We have 4 of the top 6 universities. I imagine Oxford and Cambridge are 2 of them. Maybe Imperial's another one. I don't know if anyone knows what the 4th is. And for every pound spent by the government on research and development, private sector R&D productivity rises by 20p per year forever. And that boils down to a 300% return on that investment. So in terms of productivity, spending on science is good value. The question is, the challenge rather that ministers have had to face in recent months is, if it's such good value, why aren't you spending more? Well, of course, at some point you're going to get diminishing returns. You know, if you spend 10% of your GDP on science and research, you'll be losing out in other areas. There is research to suggest an optimal level of funding might be up to about 3% of GDP, significantly more than we currently spend. And I think even the government would recognise the truth of that. But of course, the government has other priorities as well, one of which is deficit reduction, on which they have a manifesto commitment. So they have got to perform a balancing act. But the question is, how much should we spend to save? Well, I'm going to drill down and look at public spending now. I looked at spending from all sectors, including business. Looking at public sector, I won't spend too much on the trends here. This is from 1986 to the present almost. The research councils account for a lot of public expenditure, channeled via BIS, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. The higher education funding councils, for example, HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, provide funding for research. So the research councils and the funding councils largely support the universities. The research councils also have their own facilities and their own scientists as well, which will be in receipt of some support. The civil departments, these are government departments commissioning research. The Department of Health is a very good example. They have a very large research program. And that, just looking at that curve, I can just about make it out. What we spend in real terms today, by the expenditure by the civil departments today, looks roughly similar to what it was in 1986. What's dramatic, though, if you look at the MOD expenditure on research and development, in 1986, that was about £5 billion. Now it's somewhat less, looking at the curve, less than 2 billion. So the MOD spending on research has fallen quite dramatically. And of course that will have knock-on effects to the rest of the science and innovation infrastructure. So having looked at the main sources of public funding, research councils, higher education funding councils, which are part of what I would call the science budget, and the civil departments and the MOD, I now want to look at what I would call the science-based budget, usually referred to as the science budget. The budget administered by BIS on behalf of the nation to support fundamental science research. And the key feature of that is the so-called dual support funding mechanism. The research councils provide grants for specific projects and programs. So if you're a university researcher, you apply for a grant to work in that particular field or on a particular project. And they're competitive, they're highly competitive. I was in a meeting last week and the figure 10% success rate, I think, I heard in some cases. So much so that some academics are wondering why bother, if I've only got 1 in 10 chance of being successful. Then you have the higher education funding bodies. It's a devolved matter, so you have them for the 4 parts of the United Kingdom. They provide so-called block grant funding to universities. They write a cheque and give it to the university, and the university is more or less free to spend it on what research it likes. This enables them to support blue skies, stuff that may or may not bear fruit. I remember years ago, at Durham University, a bit of anecdote here, there's a lecturer there who, if you went to Durham University in the late 1970s, you'd see what looked like lots of little rabbit hutches scattered around the science campus. In fact, they contain sophisticated cosmic ray detection equipment. And this guy was trying to find magnetic monopoles, amongst other things. Well, a magnetic dipole is a north-south pole, a bar magnet. Physics predicts there's no such thing as magnetic monopoles, but he was looking for them anyway. And we called him the world's greatest expert in non-existent particles. But the point is, he would not have got Research Council funding probably. He'd have to rely on this sort of blue skies funding to pursue that sort of research, which is a long shot. But even with the unlikelihood of success, it still trains, young scientists in developing new methods, new sensors, new detectors, which can have all kinds of spin-offs. So just a bit more detail on the research councils now. The research councils, they have an overarching body called Research Councils UK, and I've listed the research councils there. I've illustrated some of them with 3 pictures. The low one is a miracle of modern science. That's the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is part of CERN, which is an international organisation, but the Science and Technology Facilities Council administers the UK's contribution and funds UK scientists to work at CERN, among other things. The STFC has its own big facilities based at Harwell as well. The middle picture, I guess, is supposed to be some sort of representation of DNA, and that's just to remind you that the Medical Research Council is involved, and also the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council are another example, or other examples of research councils. The top picture I put slightly mischievously there. I thought about asking what you thought it might be. Does anyone want to hazard a guess? No? I was hoping someone would say something like some crystal lattice or something. It's actually a work of digital art, nothing to do with science at all. But that's really just to drive home the point that the Arts and Humanities Research Council also comes within the science budget. So science is interpreted broadly as a general pursuit of knowledge. And so you have the Arts and Humanities Research Council, you have the Economic and Social Research Council, together with what you could call the Natural Science Research Councils that look at physics, biology, and so on. One of the questions, of course, is how the funds for the research councils allocated. We expect an announcement imminently on what the current funding settlement is. There have been concerns by for example, the Science and Technology Facilities Council that that they need more resource funding to sweat their assets, as the saying goes. They've got large capital facilities, many of them in Harwell, which are being underused at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if they get a bigger share from the funding settlement or not. They're certainly being among the most vocal of the research councils. The research councils were subject to the Nurse Review, which reported in November. Sir Paul Nurse, until recently the president of the Royal Society, and his key recommendations were to establish Research UK as a non-departmental public body that would take an overview of the research councils. It would include also Innovate UK, and it would also possibly, this hasn't been decided as far as I know, possibly administer the block grant currently given out by the Higher Education Funding Council for England. So the idea behind Research UK was to provide a more strategic oversight and operation of research, and to get more and more people singing from the same hymn sheet and collaborating more and getting more bang for the taxpayer's buck. I mean, slightly cynically, you might imagine that Research UK looks a bit like Research Councils UK, but Research UK would be a more formal statutory organisation and certainly would have more scope for bringing together the Research Council's work than the less formal arrangement that they have through the collaboration under Research Councils UK. The other recommendation of the Nurse Review was to establish a ministerial committee chaired by a senior minister with cross-cutting cabinet responsibilities to try to coordinate government expenditure on research and development. Now, the government hasn't formally responded to the Nurse Review yet, but they've said they'll take forward the responses, but they're going to factor in other reviews, which I'll mention during this talk. Okay, that was the research councils. Here are the higher education funding councils. I've just listed them there. The biggest being the English one at the top. And that's also been the subject of review in the Higher Education Green Paper, which was published in November. And the headline there is to essentially abolish HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council of England, but retain the dual support funding mechanism. In other words, to retain grant funding of the style given out by research councils with this block grant to fund Blue Skies research of the university's choosing. Hitherto, or most recently, what has determined the share of Higher Education Funding Council of England grant to individual universities has been what's called the Research Excellence Framework. It's seen in some quarters as being rather bureaucratic, involving a lot of work, perhaps not giving as much emphasis to collaborative work as it might. So if you're the sole author of a research paper, it probably gives you more weight than if you're one of several hundred authors. And in some areas of science, the collaboration has got to the level where you have several hundred authors putting their names on research papers. So there's also a review of the Research Excellence Framework as well that's going on. And that's currently underway. So the message from this slide essentially is that the government is reviewing the operation of the block grant to universities in England. Right, so let's have a look at the science budget that funds both the research councils and the Higher Education Funding Council. Now, these figures, I think, are all of the UK research councils plus the Higher Education Funding Council for England. It also includes things like national academies, and I think it also includes some funding for space exploration as well. Incidentally, the slides you see here will be available, and I've got my speaking notes, which I'm not using, unfortunately, also attached to the slides, and you'll be able to access both shortly on the intranet. So let's have a look at the science budget as it currently stands. In red, if you look at the left-hand figure, shows you the capital budget for things like facilities, a new major research centres and so on. That showed a dip around about 2012, 2013, which did cause some problems for the science base, but then the government made good on that and increased it. And it shows the capital budget going forward rising in cash terms, but effectively being constant in real terms. It'll be about £1.1 billion a year until 2019-2020. That turns out to come to about £6.9 billion altogether, taking into account inflation. And that was the figure mentioned in the Conservative manifesto for capital budget. So the government's confirmed that. The dotted line shows what the capital budget would look like if it stayed the same in real terms since 2020. So you can see the capital budget has actually been increased. Okay, there was that dip in 2012, and from which recovery had to be made. The resource budget, the salaries, the electricity bills, and so on, the operating expenses, has been more or less constant at about 4.6 or 4.7 billion pounds from 2010 all the way to 2020. And that's effectively the resource budget. There's been some confusion. I don't want to nitpick about whether it's 4.6 billion or 4.7 billion. Until the end of the last Parliament, the science resource budget was 4.6 billion within a ring fence. It was ring fenced at 4.6 billion, protected. The government subsequently added some extra initiatives, I think one of which was the Newton Fund, which actually had the effect of raising the resource budget to 4.7 billion, except it wasn't technically within the ring fence. Well, now it's been brought within the ring fence. had the resource budget stayed the same from 2020 and written in real terms, you can see it would be a lot higher than it is today. So this is where we were, or what we were anticipating before the spending review. Things are arguably somewhat better since the spending review, and I'll come to that presently. The spending review, or the oncoming spending review, prompted the Science and Technology Select Committee to launch an inquiry into the science budget with a clear intention of influencing the outcome of the spending review. And the committee reported before the spending review, not long before, but certainly before, and the headline recommendation, which the chair of the committee, Nicola Blackwood, is quoted there saying, the UK risks losing its status as a science superpower if the Treasury does not make a long-term commitment to increase science funding in the spending review. So the Select Committee, the headline was an increase, a long-term commitment to increase science funding. In fact, they wanted a roadmap, as they put it, to move UK public and private spending towards 3% from its current 1.7% at some point in the future. Didn't say when. The committee also made the point that it was important to have sufficient resource funding to sweat the assets, to make good use of, to make optimal use of existing facilities. The ones that are often mentioned are the ISIS facility at Harwell. That's ISIS is it's a neutron beam for investigating the structure of matter. And the diamond light source, which is a very strong source, I think it's about 1 billion times more intense than the sun, X-rays, ultraviolet, infrared, again used across the scientific community. I was at Harwell about 6 months ago, I think, or more than that, less than a year ago. And I was looking around the diamond facility, and I went into one little room where they have lots of beam lines, and the room was occupied by a bunch of academics from York University looking at images of worms that sort of lived near volcanoes or something. So I mean, it's used by the life sciences, the physical sciences, the engineering sciences, and by industry to do all kinds of checks on structures. Could be cement, or could be some part for a Rolls-Royce engine, for example. So that was the Select Committee's report. Now, okay, it's not unheard of for Select Committees to recommend the government spend more money on whatever it is. But clearly the Select Committee received evidence from the science community. You know, they didn't get evidence from the Arts Council saying, you spent too much on science, you should give us more. So the evidence is obviously going to be weighted to some degree. Having said that, you know, the government had the full opportunity to make their case for their current position, and the government does acknowledge that science is important for national productivity. So how did the spending review respond to the Select Committee? First of all, they reiterated their long-term commitment on capital expenditure, £6.9 billion between 2015 and 2021. That works out to be 1.1 billion in real terms per annum. So that's supporting the research base, the big facilities, the buildings as well. You know, if the roof falls in your biology lab, you need a new roof. Well, that's capital expenditure, I guess. Or if you need a new lab. An example that was given in the spending review is to include up to £150 million, this was actually capital and resource spending, to launch a competition for a Dementia Institute. Now, this is quite interesting because it's one example of a government's approach increasingly to launch great initiatives and to perhaps to pick winners, arguably, whether it's a Dementia Institute or some other, or the Turing Institute, for example, that's opening at the British Library. So there's a suggestion here that's been made that the government is spending more money on science, but perhaps hinting a bit or directing science in certain directions, picking winners, if you like. And a question has arisen as to the degree to which that's appropriate. The government response would be that A, it's taxpayers' money, and B, the government, it's not a civil servant sitting in an office just thinking up initiatives. They are engaging with the scientific community to identify, key areas where investment is justified. So that was the capital commitment, so no change. On the resource funding, the government said they would protect today's 4.7 billion. So that was a recognition that the resource funding was now 4.7 billion. In real terms for the rest of the Parliament, well, that sounds good. Real terms means no more flat cash. It'd been flat cash at 4.6 billion, rising to 4.7 billion for the last Parliament. The government now said it would actually protect it in real terms. It would go beyond flat cash. What I think is a potential catch here, and this has been identified by a number of speakers in today's debate, in fact, on the Estimates Day, is that 4.7 billion real terms includes 1.5 billion for Global Challenges Fund, which is part of the official development assistance. So in other words, the increase you get, so in other words, what that means is the resource budget going forward will be flat cash plus a Global Challenges Fund. So the people who got flat cash before might think they're still getting flat cash going forward. It all depends, of course, where the Global Challenges Fund money actually goes, and that remains to be seen. They've only just launched a competition, I think, on the Zika virus for the Medical Research Council, has put out a call for bids for research programs there. Well, just to develop this point a bit further, this is a picture that I took actually. I stole the best seat in the auditorium. It wasn't reserved, so I took it. This was a speech the Science Minister gave in January at the Campaign for Science and Engineering, 27th of January. And he made the point that the Global Challenges Fund, he said that not only, from memory, this is my memory here, not only was the government maintaining its commitment to spend 0.7% of GDP on overseas development, but the Global Challenges Fund would be contributing to that. It would also contribute to increasing the science budget in real terms. Now that sounds like a win-win, but playing devil's advocate, you could say is it double counting? Global challenges, real terms increase. It's how you want to present it. And the Secretary of State, speaking to the Select Committee a few weeks later, actually it was the 19th of January, I think, so anyway, in January, reiterated the point that the Global Challenges Fund, he said it's not been tucked in. One of the phrases is tucking extra things. So you say you've maintained or increased the budget, but you've actually put more stuff into it. He refuted the suggestion that the Global Challenges Fund had been tucked in, but then did acknowledge that without it, the science resource budget is flat cash. And then he said that the detailed science budget allocations would be announced mid-February. Well, they haven't been announced yet, but the minister speaking today said the announcement would be imminent. So it'll be interesting to see what those allocations are among the different research councils, because historically the allocations to research councils have been more or less constant over the years. Right, okay, that was spending on basic research. I just want to say a few words about commercialising this and moving into the innovation space. On the left-hand side, I've got a thermometer which illustrates what are called technology readiness levels, TRLs. And the first three technology, it's not very clear, so I'll read it out. The first three technology levels, 1, 2, and 3, go from basic principles to proof of concept. This is the sort of thing you'd expect a university department to do, whether it's a physics or engineering or whatever. The highest levels, 7 to 9, operations deployment, are what you'd expect a business to do. that was working in the tech sector. The middle ones, bench scale, pilot scale, large scale, technology levels 4 to 6 are often referred to as the valley of death. This is a colourful way of expressing how the difficulty in taking research discoveries from the university department or the research council facility to the marketplace. How do you bridge that gap? And that's where Innovate UK, formerly called the Technology Strategy Board, comes in. So that they make grants available to businesses to help them bridge that gap, to bring to the marketplace innovative technologies and so on. And one way that, I mentioned grants. Innovate UK also has certain catapult centres, so-called. An example is the Satellite Centre in Harwell again. And the Satellite Centre in Harwell, I think, gets about a third of its funding from Innovate UK grants, about a third from business, it sells its services, and about a third from the European Union, I think, in that particular case. But the catapults will have slightly different models, but they're all funded to some degree by Innovate UK under the innovation budget, not part of the science budget. One of the announcements in the spending review was that some of those grants would switch to being loans, but the overall amount of funding available would be broadly the same, but some of it would be loan funding. Other examples of the innovation landscape. So that was the top level. Incidentally, that picture I showed of the thermometer, the linear scale, from brilliant, original, basic science discovery to a new washing up liquid in Tesco's. That's a rather linear model of how science innovation works. If you go to places like the Science Policy Research Unit in Sussex, they've got people there working on all kinds of feedback loops and getting more accurate representation of how innovation actually works in practice. But those technology readiness levels, from brilliant idea to washing up liquid in Tesco's, that linear approach is still, I think, a reasonable representation of how science and innovation work in practice. I just want to give one example to do with local innovation. Local enterprise partnerships, which were set up on a sort of voluntary basis following the abolition of the regional development agencies, which didn't last very long. They're in place there to foster business development in local areas. And there's a pilot scheme, University Enterprise Zones, but it's only £15 million, quite a small scheme that's going on at the moment, that will encourage universities to engage with the LEPs and local businesses. So this is one scheme to encourage business-university collaboration in terms of making information available, making facilities available. And I've listed the 4 universities that were successful in becoming university enterprise zones there: Bradford, Bristol, Liverpool and Nottingham. Now, this is not the most important innovation project around. Like I say, Innovate UK is the big player, the big hitter, but in addition to Innovate UK, you've got things like the National Physical Laboratory or the Intellectual Property Office, all of whom are involved in that sort of innovation space, whether it's enabling patents or whether it's providing facilities for businesses to do measurements. But I mentioned local enterprise partnerships as just one example of where innovation is also occurring. If you want to see what the innovation picture looks like in a diagram, prepare yourself for a shock. This is a simplification of what innovation works like, and I'm not expecting you to actually take this on board and commit it to memory, but it's an important diagram to show because it's been referred to many times, both by the chair of the Select Committee, who I think it gave nightmares to. It gives nightmares to its author, Anne Dowling, who's the president of the Academy of Engineering, Royal Academy of Engineering. It gives nightmares also to the chief executive of Innovate UK. The only person who doesn't give nightmares to is the chief scientific advisor. I'll explain why. First of all, this diagram comes from the Darling Review of Business University Research Collaborations, which I think reported in July 2015. The government has not yet responded to that review. The government said it will respond to the Nurse Review on the Research Councils, the Darling Review on innovation, if you like, the Green Paper on higher education. It's going to respond to all of those in one go in the coming months. But the key recommendation of the Darling Review was, you will not be surprised to learn, let's see if I can find it, even though I can't, the key recommendation was that the innovation landscape is too complicated. And I think that diagram probably explains why. And Damon Darling used a memorable phrase suggesting that we need to hide the wiring to enable businesses to engage with the funding opportunities that this diagram illustrates. So, you've got the big ones, universities, businesses, you've got LEPS and Green on the left there, all these different funding opportunities. It's a minefield for small businesses. They just don't have the time or the access to the information to know where to start looking. Now, the only positive thing that comes out of this is the Chief Scientific Advisor said, well, this is Sir Mark Walport, if you apply for innovation funding and you fail, you've got lots of alternatives there. So it's not all doom and gloom, but it's clearly a confused landscape. Well, on to innovation. Just to end with 3 slides on policy. In 2014, December 2014, the coalition government published its strategy for science and innovation called Our Plan for Growth. The science minister confirmed in July 2015 that this is the overarching policy of the government. It remains the Conservative government's overarching policy. And it identified 5 key principles that should underpin science policy for the next decade. And these principles do read a bit like motherhood and apple pie, but there is more to them if you look at them in a little bit more detail. First of all, the importance of achieving excellence. That means that's an assertion implied there of the so-called Haldane principle, more of which later, shortly, which means that what research is done, what research is funded, will ultimately be decided by experts, not by a civil servant or minister. The ministers or civil servants, in consultation with experts, might identify strategic areas, but what you actually support will be determined by peer review, by people who know what they're talking about, in short. The next principle, imperative to operate at a quickening pace and show agility to seize new opportunities. Agility is a key word there. If you want the agility to seize new opportunities, new research discoveries, graphene is a good example in Manchester, you need to have a broad science base. You need to have people who can sort of realise and appreciate the significance of a new discovery wherever it occurs in the world, and to pick up that baton and run with it. So that second principle implies a broad science base. Third principle, the need to accommodate and foster higher levels of collaboration between disciplines, sectors, people and communities, institutions. Again, this is to do with, for example, university enterprise zones and LEPS. The need to recognise the importance of place, where people and organisations benefit from mutual proximity. I can give a little example here. The National Physical Laboratory, based in Teddington, Middlesex, they have 1 or 2 people located in Huddersfield working with the university there, and they attest to the fact that they're much more effective being there, working with the academics in Huddersfield, in ensuring that they bring together the knowledge, they pull knowledge in that way. It might also be an allusion to possibly the Northern Powerhouse, maybe this idea of place. Are we going to sort of look towards where the money should go? Not just what it should go on, but where it should be located. And there have been various initiatives. An ageing centre in Newcastle comes to mind. And finally, the modern demand for openness and engagement with the world. Well, I'm not saying that's topical in the context of the in-out referendum at the moment. And the point was made in today's debate that collaboration with the European Union is important, but also that the UK collaborates far beyond the European Union as well. So these are the sort of 5 basic principles of the science strategy. It mentions the Haldane principle. This is probably a bit sort of esoteric here, but the key Haldane principle is the fourth, and it's often referred to as the Haldane principle, that the choice of how and by whom that research should be conducted should be left to the decision of experts, peer review. There are other Haldane principles, all of which date back to 1918. It was Haldane wrote his report then, and the government in its science strategy reaffirms those Haldane principles. So, you know, the belief in evidence-based policy, that government departments should fund their own research and not ask for necessarily freebies from universities. That there should be a general department charged with funding research questions. Well, that's the Government Office for Science based in BIS. I mentioned the experts deciding what's done, and then you've got collaboration between government departments and the need for a department associated with applied research for trade and industry. So Haldane principle means number 4. Haldane principles means all of those 6. Just finally, just flag up some possible policy themes, and these are just ones that immediately came to mind. In industrial strategies, where the government's identified key areas for additional support. That support could be financial in terms of loans. It can be, well, I was going to say spiritual, but that's not quite the right word. It can be sending signals that the government is going to make certain procurement decisions, or it's going to give back into certain areas in terms of regulation, for example. So there are different ways of supporting key sectors. And so you have industrial strategies. Within that you have 8 great technologies. I put 8 in inverted commas because there are now more than 8, there are about 10 or 11 great technologies that have been identified as deserving of future support. I mentioned the catapult centres, more being created. A new one on semiconductors was created recently in Wales. And of course, there's a Northern Powerhouse agenda, if you like, to sweat the assets of universities and skills and talent outside the universities in the north of England. Finally, further information, library papers I've mentioned there, Support for Science, statistics one on support on spending on research and development in the UK, the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee inquiry, not just the actual report, but all of the written evidence is available online as well. By all means, get in touch with me with any questions. And slightly controversially, I've put down a book, The Geek Manifesto, Why Science Matters. It's a very good read. It's clearly got an agenda, and as long as you factor that into your interpretation of it, you might find it useful in helping you understand where the scientist community is coming from. Questions? Comments? Yeah.
I was interested in the Haldane principles. Do you think you could perhaps put them back again for a second?
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah.
That sounds all very sensible, but my question is, what it doesn't tell us is what it's all for, what the purpose is. If you sort of it talks about the choice of research being left to the decision of experts, and by experts I take that to mean scientific experts.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that science needs to think about is why are scientists doing what they're doing? What's the reason for doing it? What problem are we trying to solve? What is the issue? And it strikes me that there is an issue. There is a huge issue that we need solving, but we don't seem to be focusing our efforts towards it. So I'm kind of wondering whether it's time to perhaps review those principles. So the big issue is the fact that if you think about the big problems in the world, what we've got is nearly half of the population in the world, and a substantial proportion of the population in the UK living at the bottom end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So on a hand-to-mouth basis, they're not able to really have a self-actualised life. And I think what a lot of people talk about is they want people to be able to live that self-actualised life. And on the other hand, we've got environmental crisis, without a shadow of a doubt, that we're putting all of ourselves in risk. And what you tend to get is some people trying to solve the environmental crisis and then being criticised because nobody wants to live in a hair shirt and stopping carbon dioxide emissions is quite hard. And then get something trying to solve the poverty equation, and then getting criticised by the environmental lobby, because of course if we attempt to get those who live in poverty now to live in the same consumer way that we do now, then it will damage the climate. And it strikes me that the Haldane principles are worth reviewing, because the one thing that science has got to focus on doing is resolving that dilemma. And scientists can do that with much of the stuff that they can learn or invent or whatever, and we have to solve that dilemma. So it strikes me that they're just a little bit out of date and a bit for the back. Do you think there's any possibility that they might be reviewed?
Well, that's the sort of question I love, actually, because, I mean, you're going to be carte blanche to speak for hours if I wanted to. That's a big question. The answer to your final question is no. I don't think there's any realistic chance of them being reviewed. The government has continually reaffirmed its commitment to the Haldane principles and the dual support mechanism. Now, of course, these principles should be viewed primarily as being important in the context of pure research. So, yes, you've got the applied directed research, whether it's a call for proposals to do research on Zika, for example, or climate change issues, or small modular reactors, for example. There's currently an assessment going on, which will report, I think, this month on the best design for a small nuclear reactor for the UK. And that will factor into the climate change issue as well. But the directed research is something that I think comes under number two. I think number two, the second Haldane principle, that each government department should provide funds to answer specific policy questions or perhaps to deal with specific policy issues. So, for example, DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, has a certain responsibility, I think it would accept, to fund research into new energy technologies, into energy efficiency measures and so on, smart meters and that kind of thing. So I think that your point is covered by the second Haldane principle. So the Haldane principles have been fairly sort of resilient over the years. Now, as to whether, I don't know if you were hinting that perhaps should we be funding some boffin with a pipe to do calculations on string theory or something like this, or cosmology, when we've got all these Earth-like problems to solve. I mean, I was at CERN, just a name drop, last week, and I think they are very alert to the fact that the research they're doing is extremely pure. You're looking at, they're interested in what the universe was like 1/100th of a billionth of a second after the Big Bang. 100th of a billionth of a second. Some people think nothing really interesting happened after that, and they're interested in even smaller time scales. You might think, why on earth are you doing this? Now, obviously, there's a curiosity element, and it does inspire people, and it does help train up the next generation of industrialists and so on. But look at the medical applications you mentioned, fulfilling life. Proton therapy that's been in the news quite recently. I think UCL, University College Hospital, is building a proton beam, pretty much an off-the-shelf version, I think, rather than the top-notch. That's highly effective at treating certain kinds of cancer, particularly child cancer, for example, cancer of organs which are, in difficult places, maybe the brain. I'm not sure about the brain. But certainly certain cancers benefit, or rather their treatment benefits from using proton therapy. Now, if you didn't do pure research, you wouldn't even know what a proton was.
I was really picking up actually on number two, because if you commission research by department, you do get into the position where the lot that are responsible for climate change look for a solution to climate change, and the lot that are responsible for the standard of living of the population look for a solution to that. And the difficulty is that they're in conflict with each other. So somehow, if everybody's working to a higher aim, those things should be brought together. And whilst I absolutely agree that pure researchers need to be left to purely research, it's very useful if they understand that there is a guiding dilemma that we're all looking to solve, so that when they realise something, when they invent something, or when they learn something, they are much more alive to spotting that it may assist in that solution. whereas things may be passed over. You know, there's lots of things we
Yep.
discover that just get left on the shelf. But we need a method of encouraging people to realise what they've just discovered may be really useful. It just strikes me that it was probably time to have a look again, given that we're in this situation of, you know, forthcoming danger for humanity.
Well, a number of points in response to that. First of all, I think the government will argue with some justification that going along with the Support Nurses recommendation to form Research UK, which will bring together the Research Council, so bring all these what you might call competing interests together, bringing Innovate UK within that, you know, tent, and bringing in the Blue Skies element from the quality research funding, the block grant funding, bringing all of that together into one, you know, organisation could, you know, help address those potential conflicts.
And I agree, but it needs to have a focus and purpose that's very clear.
And the academics certainly are being more and more alert to the impact agenda. When they fill in their grant applications, they're having to sort of say, what is the impact of your research? Now, if you're a string theorist, you might have to sort of say, well, look, I hold my hands up, it's just going to help me inspire the next generation of mathematicians or whatever. But they are very alert that they are more likely to be successful in getting funding if they can demonstrate an impact for their research. So they are being told to, you know, stop and think, could this be used somewhere? So I think the issues you raise, and I don't think there necessarily is a conflict between solving climate change and improving you know, the health and wealth of the population. I wouldn't accept that necessarily is a conflict.
And there shouldn't be, but of course, because it's done in this unjoined up way, that sometimes is what it appears to be, and you get people arguing, you know, between themselves, when actually we should be searching for those win-win solutions.
Well, the glib answer is the establishment of Research UK. That's a start, I think, in the right direction.
It's a very good thing.
Yeah. Thanks, sir. Any more questions, John? No? Well, thank you for your attention. I'd like to please feel free to email or telephone. We'd be very happy to help, both myself and my statistical colleagues. And thanks for staying with me this long. Thank you.